Webinar, Wildfire Resilience, How Outdoor Recreation Groups Can Lead in Mitigation and Preparedness. My name is Ryan Stewart, and I'm facilitating today's webinar. I'm going to give folks a few minutes to log in. While we're doing that, I'd love to get a sense of who all is out there and tuning in today. The format of this Zoom webinar is such that we can't see you, us folks on the panel, and you can't see each other. So I thought I would invite you all to just add into the chat there your name and where you are today, and give us all a bit of a sense of who all is in the community. And while you're doing that, I'll just give you a little bit of housekeeping. We are recording today's webinar, and later this week we'll email you with the recording along with other material that's discussed, little notes and takeaways, resources, links, things like that. If you have any questions, please pop them into the Q&A little button down there at the bottom, and we'll do our best to answer them. One of the panelists might be able to weigh in directly. Otherwise, we'll have a Q&A session a little bit later in the webinar, and I'll do my best to ask everybody's questions during that time. And definitely also feel free to use the chat to, weigh in on anything you hear, use reactions if you like. It's always nice to know that you guys are still out there listening and hearing what we're saying and engaged with what we're talking about. So feel free to do that and get involved. Okay, I think I'll get started, and I'll start by sharing my screen. So again, welcome to the Outdoor Recreation Council of BC's webinar, Wildfire Resilience, How Outdoor Recreation Groups Can Lead in Mitigation and Preparedness. I'd like to first acknowledge that I am grateful to live, work, and play on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Comox First Nation. In the spirit of reconciliation, we're making a donation to the Salish Firekeeper Society. The society is working to revive interior Salish traditional and cultural fire burning practices with the goal of healing the environment and themselves. Here's today's agenda. We'll start with presentations from our three guests, followed by question and answer session. We'll wrap things up a little after 2 o'clock Pacific time. If you have any questions during the webinar, please post them in the Q&A. I'll do my best to ask them to our guests, and I apologize in advance if I miss any. Immediately following the webinar is a super short survey. Please stick around and take a moment to fill it out. It helps us do a better job with these webinars and cover topics that you want to learn about. This is part of a monthly series of webinars put on by the Outdoor Recreation Council of BC. The ORCBC represents more than 100 not-profit organizations and is the only unified voice for the outdoor recreation in BC. We work with our members, government agencies, First Nations, and other organizations, and the public to support outdoor activities that benefit people, local communities, and the natural environment. As a nonprofit, the ORCBC relies on outside funding sources, including donations from people like you. All donations are tax deductible and eligible for a tax receipt. You can find out more at orcbc.ca. Okay, let's get on to today's webinar. I'm really excited about today's topic. It was suggested to us by the great people at the Shuswap Trail Alliance, and it came to them from those informal conversations that make conventions and conferences so important and valuable. A small group of mountain bike club representatives were talking about what role they could play in mitigating forest fire risk to their communities. I think this idea resonated with us at the ORCBC and with the folks at the Shuswap Trail Alliance because it sums up what we are all about in the outdoor recreation community. We tend to be community-minded, civic-minded, and we tend to be doers, people of action. The increase in occurrence and severity of forest fires, climate-related disasters in general, that rubs up against both those traits. They threaten our communities and they seem so out of our control. But what if this wasn't entirely true? How empowering would that feel? And I think we have three speakers today who are especially well placed to inspire us with perspective and ideas. John Pelosi is the communications officer assigned to prevention with the BC Wildfire Service. The service is the primary provincial agency that responds and plans for wildfires. One of its most proactive programs is Fire Smart BC, which helps communities and individuals reduce forest fire risk. Kevin Crease was the chair of the Forest Practices Board and is now working on wildfire resilience with the POLIS Project on Ecological Governance at the University of Victoria. But today he's primarily going to share with us his experience as the trail coordinator with the Bulkley Valley Cross Country Ski Club. where he led fuel treatment projects in partnerships with the community forest and the BC Wildfire Service. And finally, Brooklyn Rushton wears many hats related to this conversation. She lives in Jasper, where she's a guide, and she lived through last year's fires. She's also a PhD candidate studying nature-based tourism, and she is the Strategic Adaptation Fellow at the Resilience Institute, a charitable organization whose goal is to help communities become more resilient in the face of climate change. Thank you all for being here. And I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to pass the microphone over to John to get us started. Maybe, John, can you tell us a little bit more about the Wildfire Service and some of the programs that the audience might be interested in?
Sure thing. Hi, everybody. Sorry, I'm just going to get my screen sharing here. I'm hoping this is working. Now, can you see my screen at all?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay. Bear with me. Okay. How's that?
We're getting closer.
Getting closer? Okay.
Yeah,
And I think
there
there's
we
a
go.
box probably on the way. All right. Sorry about this. Okay. How's that? Oh, we're still
We
there.
can,
It's just saying there's another box. Sorry,
the
everyone.
boxes are there, but we can see your slides. Oh, that's good. We're good
Okay,
there.
there we go. Yeah, so I'm John Palazzi. I'm a communications officer assigned to prevention with BC Wildfire Service. I live in Nelson, BC, on the unceded territory of the Sinixt, Silk, and the Tanaha. I basically, as a prevention officer with BC Wildfire Service, I focus mostly on prevention messaging, such as like don't start wildfires, but also a lot of my time and most of my time really is spent on communicating messages around what we are doing and what can be done to build wildfire resiliency throughout the province. So that means working with communities and working with municipalities and individuals throughout the province. Now, before we get started, I'm just going to just talk a little bit about how the Wildfire Service operates. So the Wildfire Service operates on like land that is not governed by bylaws. So that means crown land, national and provincial parks, private land, and any fires that are happening within communities, that is the dominion of local fire services. So again, if there's bylaws, that's not us. No bylaws, that's us. And that being said, when fires happen in the interface, which is that area where fire crosses over from the forest into communities, that's when you get into multi-agency responses where BC Wildfire Service works with municipal fire departments. So we derive our authority to suppress and enact fire bans from the Wildfire Act and Regulation. And the Wildfire Act and Regulation defines the obligations for everyone in BC with respect to wildfire prevention and open fire use. So when it comes to things like ticketing, these would be issued by natural resource officers or conservation officers in the bush and not BC Wildfire Service. So we're not really enforcement. We are just the ones who could lay down the rules. So forests in BC cover 94 million hectares. It's a big province. Every year we see about 1,600 wildfires and about 720,000 hectares burn every year. This is on average, this is a 10-year average. Obviously, some years a lot more burns, some years less. In terms of fire causes, we have two main causes. We have human and lightning. So when it comes to human causes, this is where it gets really interesting. A lot of people, we hear a lot these days about arson. It's not arson. Arson's in fact like it's a tiny fraction, usually around 1%. People complain about smokers. Again, smokers, tiny fraction, around 1%. Campfires, that's another story. We do see fires from campfires about 6% across the province, but this actually is different depending on where you are. A lot more down in the lower mainland or the Coastal Fire Center, and a lot less up in the north. When it comes to lightning, we see most fires in the summer are lightning fire starts. In the spring, they are human caused. So when it comes to human caused wildfires, they're almost always preventable. It can be carelessness or negligence on the part of industry. Again, wide range of causes. When it comes to lightning, not much we can do about that. Now, this is when we get into stuff like where you're hearing prohibitions come in. And when we bring in prohibitions in the summer, It's not something we like doing, but it's something we do out of necessity, recognizing that conditions are becoming extreme and we need to minimize any risk of wildfire starting as much as we can to ensure that we have the capacity to handle what's going on around the province. So prevention, I think when we talk about wildfire in BC, 4 of the 5 most destructive and costly wildfires seasons in BC history have all happened since 2017. So number 5 is 2003. So that's really tells us that things are starting to build up in intensity. In terms of like, excuse me, sorry. So this is due to several reasons. We have climate change, obviously. Summers are getting longer, hotter, and drier. And there's also oversuppression of wildfires and exclusion of wildfire from the landscape through the suppression of First Nations use of fire in the landscape. These have all contributed to BC forests becoming sort of seeing fuel buildup. And when things get hot and dry and conditions are ripe, they ignite and fires burn out of control. So the prevention program goal is to reduce the negative impact of wildfire on public safety, property, and the environment and the economy. So we do this by using the 7 disciplines of the Fire Smart program, which help not only prevent fires from happening, but reduce wildfire risk through fuel treatments and build more fire resilient communities. So, excuse me, wildfire risk reduction projects that reduce fuels, they don't stop fires. That's not the goal of these. What they do is they help slow fires down and they give our crews a defensible space to work in. So that's the primary goal of wildfire risk reduction. And together, this whole society approach is designed to build fire smart communities, more resilient landscapes, and a system for basically making sure fire doesn't happen. And when it does, we can suppress it quickly. So the prevention programs that operate in the province, we work closely with local governments, First Nations, industry, and the nonprofit sector to reduce wildfire risk through programs that provide guidance and funding. Typically, in the average year, we spend, or rather we allocate about $90 million to wildfire prevention initiatives throughout the province. So this could include various programs that operate under the BC Wildfire Service Program, but also to the Forest Enhancement Society of BC. So in BC, we have 3 main programs that all happen underneath the Community Resilience Investment Program. So the first is the Crown Land Wildfire Risk Reduction Program, or the CLWRR. These are fuel treatments on Crown land in the WUI, which is the wildland urban interface around communities out to about 2 kilometers. Since 2018, we've treated about 12,650 hectares. Frankly, it's a fraction of what we need to be treating, but we're in the process of building capacity and stepping things up. Then comes the Fire Smart Community Funding and Supports Program. So we get into these funny little distinctions. Is probably most people have heard of Fire Smart. Fire Smart is sort of the overarching provincial program, which is like it's education and that sort of thing. But in terms of like how it's enacted throughout the province, it needs to happen at a local level. So the Fire Smart Community Funding and Supports Program provides funding to communities throughout BC to carry this out. So they can use that money for education, planning, wildfire risk reduction activities, and working with their citizenry to basically build a more resilient community. So to date, 117 First Nations and 148 local governments have been funded through this program. And finally, this is the latest addition the program is the Fire Smart Pilot Program for regional district cooperation and community wildfire response organizations. So this provides funding to communities without local structural fire protection and provides training and equipment. So this is when people talk about like, can people volunteer to fight wildfires in BC? And it's like, the answer is actually no, they can't. But what we can do in communities that are affected is that we can train people and provide them with the equipment. And then if a fire does take place, they are activated and are, go on the payroll and are there to help assist with fire suppression. So what can clubs do to get involved? So this is kind of a challenging one. There's actually no funding at this level available for clubs or groups to carry any of this activity out. However, depending on the group's associations, whether it's with a community forest or if they are in the WUI, so they're near a city or a municipality, or if they have some relationship with the regional district, they could possibly work with those organizations to carry these activities out. The challenge is that BC is a big province. There are so many organizations doing so much great work around the province. There's no one size fits all for this sort of thing. So again, the best route is through working with your local government. Sorry, 1 second. I just pull my notes up here. So if you're wondering, like, why is it that there's no money available directly to these organizations? Part of it is because right now we're focused on what it's called values out, which is, again, we kind of look at, like, what do we need to protect first? So it's like, it starts with protecting human life, then protecting property, then protecting like local businesses and assets, critical infrastructure, and the economy, and of course the environment, especially when it comes to things like critical ecosystems. It's not that we're objecting to fire being a natural process, but in some cases we would like to make sure that uncontrolled fire doesn't burn through critical habitats. So in terms of like why we don't fund these groups, that's actually a great question. But for the time being, the best bet is through cities and local government. I think that's pretty much all I have to say on that. Actually, sorry, I'm going to add one more thing. So this is one of the interesting challenges, and I really have only had a chance to look at this over the past week, and I'm kind of excited about this panel and to hear what people have to say about this. But in terms of like, it's not so much even about what you can do to reduce wildfire risk by helping out and doing treatments. Some of it is in the activities that you do, making sure that you don't create wildfire risk. And some of this could be around things like trail building, where as you clear trails and you start piling material up on the side of the trail, the need to abate that is important. So however that's done, whether it's through dispersing the material across a wider area, or shipping it if that's at all possible, or possibly even gathering it and burning it, but that's not something you should be doing without speaking to your local fire center. But anyways, something to think about. So that was my presentation. I'm going to exit and go back to you, Ryan.
Thank you, John. So if there's no funding available for those local groups, if they're interested in having their community get started on a project like this, or one of these other opportunities that you mentioned, what's the best way for them to sort of start that conversation, or who should they approach in a community or with a First Nation? Can you give it sort of a sense of that? Oh, you're still muted there, John.
Sorry about that. So yeah, depending on where you live, I mean, if you live in a larger municipality or even actually small municipality, if there's a fire smart coordinator, that's your best place to start. I would start with reaching out to the local fire department or the municipality, find out if there's a fire smart coordinator and speaking with that person. If there is no fire smart coordinator, you might want to start with the local fire center. So you can go to the BC government website, type in what's my fire center, and you'll be able to find the map and see where you live, and then find the contact information and just reach out using the contact information and tell them who you are and that you'd like to speak with somebody in prevention, and then they can start that conversation.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. Kevin, I'm going to pass it over to you and get a bit more of an idea of what some of these partnership like this might look like on the ground. Up in Smithers there, I know you have some examples, so looking forward to hearing what you have to share. Oh, you're on mute there, Kevin.
Okay, how's my share look?
You've got the presentation open, but it's not in the presenting mode, but we can see the slides for sure.
Yeah, gotcha. I don't know why it's doing that, but okay, you can see the slides. That's good enough.
Yep.
I'll talk about first, who am I? As mentioned earlier, I actually do wildfire work with the Polis Wildfire Resilience Project. And I'm also doing a little local wildfire resilience pilot here in our valley. I'm not going to talk from that perspective, but it kind of does inform what we're doing as the trail coordinator up at BV Nordic. If people are interested in the kind of other big picture, kind of what's going on policy wise, take a look at the Polis Wildfire Resilience Project. We did a report last year called the State of Wildfire. It'll talk a lot about kind of what's up in BC and what the programs are. Here at BV Nordic, who are we? We're a full service Nordic ski facility just located outside Smithers. We have 51 kilometers of trails, actually about 56 if I start counting some of the smaller trails. We got a lodge, cabin, outbuildings, a ton of members. We're the 5th largest Nordic club in BC. And like a lot of recreation groups, we work on provincial crown land with a rec site, on a recreation site through a management agreement with Rec Sites and Trails BC. And we are also situated inside a community forest about 5 kilometers west of Smithers. So that's kind of where we sit and what we're trying to deal with. This is a little screenshot from Google Earth where you can see the town of Smithers down in the valley and our trail network up here kind of on a little plateau, about 5 to 8 kilometers west of town. And we're up in the forest. And this is kind of one of the critical factors about why fire smart and fire protection and fire mitigation matters to us. So that's kind of the situation that we live with, and I'll talk a little bit about what we've been up to in terms of wildfire risk. But first, it's kind of like maybe obvious to folks, but you got to kind of take a look at where you're situated and what your risks are. We are located in a fire-prone forest. The province does something called the Provincial Strategic Threat Assessment that categorizes the level of wildfire risk. A big chunk of the province is at risk. And our particular forests are pretty much at high or extreme risk. Like we are just up at the top. And from our perspective, and sort of you talk to wildfire experts, it's not a question of if these forests will burn, it's a question of when. They burned probably in the 30s. There was a big glut of fire. We've all lived through a very wet period. If you were born post-war, and grew up in that kind of period, it was an uncharacteristically wet period in Canada and British Columbia, and we didn't have a lot of fires. But in the past, late 19th century, early 20th century, there was a hell of a lot more fire on the landscape. So fire is going to come back at us, made worse by climate change. In our part of the world, these are stand replacing crown fires that are common. So it's very different than if you are living in, Seminarm, Kelowna, Kootenays, where you get that low elevation, dry Ponderosa pine IDF forest where you might have had very frequent low severity fires. We live in a place where high severity stand replacing fires are infrequent, but when they happen, they burn hot, burn fast, burn big. So we don't get that nice gentle fire kind of thing. We just get rippers. I should say there historically was some of the more gentle stuff under Indigenous fire, but the kind of lightning-driven, climate-driven fires were big rippers, like the one on the right. Creates a really high level of risk when you have communities and trails and things existing inside that forested interface. So with that said, we recognize we started to have risk. We were actually on an evacuation alert in 2023 from a fire nearby. So we haven't had a fire right downtown, but we have had fire nearby. So we have begun to protect our assets. So John mentioned the Fire Smart program. That's our first place to look, is if you have assets, even if it's something as small as a trail cabin or, some, trailside facilities, your first job is protect those assets. Second thing is do what you can to either reduce your hazard or to help others reduce hazard in your area. So we've done some field work with the BC Wildfire Service. We are managing fuel on our trails, and then we're participating in, and I think we're just supportive of landscape fuel management in the forest nearby, led by others, and I'll talk about those. So Fire Smart, the picture on the right, if you haven't seen it, is the kind of report you get if you go through a Fire Smart assessment. Great little program, nice and tidy, but why do it? Well, first off, we have $5 million worth of equipment and buildings. Like when you have big lodges, you have track setters, you have other stuff. Like we got a lot of assets at risk. They are at risk if the forest burns. If, I said nearby forest will burn, at some point they put your assets at risk. And if there's a catastrophic fire, there is no fire service in the world that can give structural protection to every building. So you have to set a mental image that if a big fire happens, you may be on your own, and your buildings and your assets will have to survive on their own. You can't expect the fire department to come when they got like 5 trucks. You look at cases like California and the LA fires and Jasper and other places, these kind of fire protection assets that are excellent at protecting buildings get swamped when you all of a sudden have these big catastrophic fires. So you got to be able to have your buildings and your assets stand on their own. So we work through our regional district has an excellent Fire Smart program. Most of British Columbia has some sort of Fire Smart program. I think at last count, there's like 150 Fire Smart coordinators across the province or somewhere in that vicinity. It's a ton more than there used to be. And they're all trained to help you do this work. So we got the assessment done. It guides you to where your risks are highest, kind of what your kind of long-term game plan is. And then we had a work bee to do some of the work. And we actually got $1,000 rebate through the Fire Smart program to help pay for some of the materials that we did. So this is a picture of what we did. Pictures of the front and the back of our ski lodge. And it looks pretty good right now, but the upper picture, which is nice and green, we've now planted grass, was kind of messy, to be honest. Like we over time just had people piling stuff nearby, and you'd get ski racks, and someone would dump some material out of the lodge when they were dusting up, and all of a sudden there's accumulated bark. And in one spot we took out like a foot of accumulated organic debris that had been accumulated over time. So we cleaned up our building, and we basically made sure that it's clean right up to a fireproof. There's concrete nearby. Get rid of anything that's flammable nearby. Looking under your decks. In this case, part of the money we used, we had cracks in some of our decking, and those cracks are the kind of thing that attracts an ember. So we basically had some volunteers come up. We bought the material, repaired the cracks in the decking, and now we're close mowing near the decks. And we basically reduced our risk quite a bit through this work bee stuff we did. Then we looked at the intermediate zone, and lo and behold, we have a wood heated building and we have a woodshed. Well, that woodshed's located about 3 meters from the lodge. So you protect your lodge, but your woodshed's sitting there and it's full of stuff. And if there's a fire, that thing's going to start on fire, and then that's going to light your lodge up. So we had to close in the woodshed with 3mm screening. We throw a piece of plywood on it during the summer so embers can't get in, but we made the woodshed fire resistant so that woodshed won't start and then pass the fire off to our main lodge. So that's kind of some of the stuff we were up to over the last couple of years to protect our lodge. I'll talk a little bit about fuel treatments. As we were doing this, BC Wildfire Service has been growing their capacity. They've got more crews on longer, and they are always looking for, no, I shouldn't say always looking. They have lots of project work, but they're looking for fuel management projects near the community. So we had some good communication with them. They built a prescription for us for the area right adjacent to our facilities, and they began a fuel treatment to try and remove essentially down material and small material on the ground and ladder fuels. So they're not removing everything. It's kind of what people would call not even a thinning treatment, but just removing ladder fuels. And the goal of that is to make sure a suppression crew can come in. If there's ever a fire through there, they got a chance to be more successful, to slow down the fire while it's on the ground. But I want to make sure people understand this is not intended to stop a wildfire. This treatment will not prevent that big rolling crown fire, but it gives BC Wildfire Service crews a chance to do a better job if they're in suppression mode. So we got really good help from them. They haven't yet burnt the piles. That's my winter picture here where they did the work last fall, and the piles are going to get lit up here hopefully in the next month or so. Talked about fuel treatments nearby. So our local licensee is doing fuel treatment work. It impacts on our trails, and we do whatever we can to make sure that they can get their job done. We don't want to pose an impediment. I will say occasionally we ask them to do things a little bit differently. There was one place where they were going to take out too many trees, and it would have affected our trails, reduced the shading, and we didn't want that. So we're able to work with them to make sure the treatment made sense. And then I'm going to talk about how we build trails. This is a little trail that we built a couple of years ago. It's kind of a narrow Nordic ski trail, unusually narrow. It's not for the piston bully style big groomer. It's for our little snowmobile groomers. But when we go in there and we start taking out trees, we're changing the wildfire risk. We're taking fuels that are up in the air, we're dropping them onto the ground, and we're actually increasing the wildfire risk. You can see how much looks like is on the ground after you've just done the falling. And so you got to make sure you're trying to dispose of that in a way that reduces the amount of risk and you're not making it worse. This trail, when it's complete, is actually a bonus to fire suppression efforts if it ever happens. It's reduced the fuel continuity, broken up a fire line if there's ever a fire on the ground. And if you ever see a suppression crew go work in somewhere that's got some constructed trails, They love it. It's a hose lay, and it gives them access to an area that otherwise wouldn't. So your trails can be an asset if they're not a problem. And so what we're doing now is we're working on expand. I got some cleanup on that trail to do. I missed a few trees first round. And so we're going in and we're actually piling some of that stuff on the trail. Crews are probably up there today doing this work for me. But we try to do some of it ourselves, and you're piling them. And in this case, this pile requires a burn permit. This is really time consuming work and expensive, but it does reduce that fuel risk as you're building trails. I think it was mentioned earlier that you can also do chipping. We did do some mulching on our previous, or we hired a mulcher who comes in and chips a lot of the stuff that was on the trail. So a lot of the needly stuff got mulched, and that's a good solution. So what are we up to now? We're doing more fire smart work. We're going to try and close in some of our historic buildings. They were not built fire smart. In fact, they're just built really kind of pretty crude. We didn't have a lot of money. So we've applied for a gaming capital grant to upgrade this building. And part of the rationale was not only to make it more long lasting, but also to make it fire smart. So we're throwing some of our money in, adding in gaming capitals matching 50%. And we're going to take this equipment shed, close off all the soffits, make the ground around it fire smart. And hopefully that building will be in a position where it can withstand a wildfire. And the other point I'll make is anything we do now on, we're thinking about fire smart from day one. So on the right is an outhouse we built last year. And, we would have done this differently in the past, but now we've moved to making sure it's metal siding on the sides, that this thing will stand a fire that wanders through, that it's not, even though it's only an outhouse, like you could afford to lose it. But just anytime you have a chance, you can build fire smart from day one. It's actually not much more expensive, or it may not even be any more expensive, just requires really being a bit more careful. And you can see we built a new machine shed about 3 years ago, and we made that puppy like really hard fire smart right from day one with metal siding. So just build right from the start. So my last slide. Don't try to be perfect. It's about reducing risk. You can't fix this all at once. It's taken us decades to get into this. It'll take us a while to get out, but do something. Focus on your critical assets first. If you have assets, maintenance matters. Keep your wood piles away from your cabins, right? Just simple stuff like that. Clean your gutters, mow your grass if you have it. All that good fire smart principles apply to us as well. If you have buildings or structures, do a fire smart assessment. When you're building trails, turn your trails into an asset. They can be helpful in terms of reducing fire risk, or they can be negative. And you have a choice on how you deal with the fuel that comes down and the wood that comes down. It is more work, but I think it's the right thing to do. And then the last thing is, get in touch with MOF. We've had a really great partnership. Like, we're lucky where we exist. The fire crews are nearby. The fire office is nearby, but they have technicians and stuff who are keen. They're also busy, but they're a great source, and you may have a forest licensee trying to do stuff nearby as well. So those are really good sources. So that's it.
Thank you, Kevin. Quick follow-up. When it comes to whether you're building a building or the trail, are there guidelines out there for folks on how to do that in a fire smart way?
Yeah, the funny part is there isn't much on trails that I could find. There's a couple little anecdotal stories about what to do. You kind of got to go back into the literature of understanding fuel management first, and those principles apply. So there's a ton of information on the fuel management expertise side, usually through foresters. See, it's nice to find if sometimes you'll find your club has a forester who's done a bit of fuel management. They might volunteer to give you some advice, and they understand the difference between fine fuel and coarse, and they understand the difference between continuity and crown fires, and like they'll give you some advice. And I think that's where I'd start.
Okay. Check your membership, see if there's an expert there. John, do you have anything to add on that point?
Yeah, actually, well, again, what I found interesting about this particular panel is when I went looking for this stuff, I didn't find anything. So we don't have any guidance on like how to construct trails. And when I went to the rec sites and trail guide BC, I couldn't find anything in their manuals either. So clearly this is something that we maybe need to create some materials for. So I actually was talking to our fuels team about this. So soon, at some point.
Excellent.
But that being said, I also did post into the chat some of the Kevin was using some great graphics from the Fire Smart Begins at Home guide. So I put that in the chat. And this is about homes, but really any, you can adapt this for any structure or any kind of asset like that. And that's generally the Fire Smart BC website. Also, like under the home tools, there's everything like on types of plantings and like how to do a self-assessment and all those kinds of guides. So highly recommend checking that out.
And is that some of that information, like if you're building an outhouse, it'll be in there, some of that information
I
of
wouldn't
like,
say like directly say an outhouse, but it would tell
yeah.
you on like structures, like basically what to think about as like Kevin said, like think about your siding, think about placement, near the forest, thinking about like what to surround it with. For example, like you really ideally you don't want any material like or any organic material butting up against the structure. Like I saw, and I think it was the equipment shed, it had like a gravel, a 1 meter-ish gravel surround, and like that's exactly what we want to see, for Fire Smart. Yeah.
Perfect. And Kevin, just one more quick question for you. The work that's getting done, whether it's, that trail work that you were doing or any of that sort of stuff, is that volunteer or are you paying crews to do that stuff?
All three. We try and use our volunteers, but they run out of gas. We do work through Rec Sites has a program every year to ask if you've got projects for wildfire crews. If the crews have an easy year, they'll show up. Especially if you're near their base, it's better because they can get to you kind of quicker. So it's worth working with Rec Sites to see if you can get support from Wildfire Service. And occasionally we have had to pay for stuff ourselves. I had a hoe on site doing some trail work, and I said, can you go gather up some piles so that I can get them burned, like do a little bit of fuel stuff while you're there. So a couple hours of hoe work gets you a lot.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you very much. Brooklyn, I'll pass it over to you for a little bit more of a zoomed out view and also some really interesting examples. So go ahead and take it over.
Let's get my screen up here. Is everyone able to see that?
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, well, yeah, thanks for inviting me here today. It was a really interesting topic. And when Ryan reached out, I was like, oh, okay, there's so much to talk about in this space and we have 10 minutes. So I'm going to focus mostly on, what is a whole of society approach? What does that mean? So zooming out a little bit more here. But to start off, I'll just introduce myself, get a little bit more background. So as mentioned, my name is Brooklyn Rushton. So I'm representing the Resilience Institute today. I'm their Strategic Adaptation Fellow. So in that role, I really focus on helping communities build capacity to deal with impacts of climate change. And I'll talk a little bit of a little broad overview about what our organization does. But I also bring my other hats with me. So I'm also doing a PhD at Wilfrid Laurier, and my focus there is really on how do we shift the tourism industry in Canada, focus mostly in protected areas, but just kind of broader nature-based tourism to a more regenerative and sustainable approach. So I've been doing that for about 4 years. And I've done a little bit of work as well on climate change impacts on mountaineering and mountain guiding and broader nature-based tourism as well. I also live in Jasper, as Ryan mentioned, so I've gotten my own lived experience of going through a wildfire. I grew up in Ontario, so that wasn't something that I really thought about too much living in the suburbs, but have been in Jasper for about 6 years. So the last 10 months, I think it's been since the fire, have been quite eye-opening for me. And I've learned a lot. I helped the municipality of Jasper for about 6 weeks after the fire and did their crisis communications. And really focus on disseminating information to residents and businesses. And I was in the re-entry phase, so lots of learning through that space as well. And then also just an avid recreationalist. So when I'm not staring at my computer screen, I'm often out running, biking, skiing, or climbing in Jasper National Park, which is a place I'm very grateful to call home, even after the fire. And a lot of my, time out west has been living in a national park. So I don't actually have a ton of experience living outside of the national park bubble. So bring a little bit of bias towards that space as well. But a little bit about the Resilience Institute. So we're a charitable organization. We work across Canada. And really our mission is to minimize suffering caused by climate change impacts. And we specifically focus our work in small, rural, and Indigenous communities, just because those often are the communities that are most on the front lines of climate change and generally sometimes the most vulnerable as well. And so our work goes into 4 different buckets, some buzzwords on the slide, but we work with a lot of universities to do applied research. We also do education as well. So a lot of capacity building through short courses, podcasts, and that kind of stuff. And we also bring an approach that weaves knowledge systems together. So when we're working in community, we weave together Western science, we bring in Indigenous knowledge and local knowledge to do a lot of the work that we do. And a lot of it's through the lens of trying to, think a bit differently and innovatively and inspiring transformative change, which I think, there's a lot on this panel presentation so far talking about, how do we do things differently in the changing world that we live in as well. One of our programs that I'll just talk about really briefly here is called Roots for Resilience. So we work with the Canadian Red Cross on a pilot program, and this is across Canada. So we have 9 pilot communities, and it's really looking at how do we build up community-driven approaches to bring together climate adaptation and disaster risk reduction. And a lot of the communities we work with are exposed to fire. Jasper is actually one of our pilot communities. And so we're actually seeing a lot of the times we're working with community to do preparedness, and then you actually have this disaster hit. So, sometimes we can't work fast enough. We're finding these days, but it's been a really cool program, and you can learn a little bit more on our website on the link below there. But into the topic here. So, I don't think I really need to talk about the fact that we know, wildfires are increasing in size, frequency, and complexity. And this, this increase is really stretching the systems that we depend on, whether it's emergency response or land management. They're really stretching them thin. And this really means that we can't, solely rely on that top-down emergency management or preparedness approaches so much anymore. And resilience now, and especially in the world that we live in, where we're seeing a lot of change and a lot of climate risk, is we really need to have resilience being embedded in communities. And I really like this this picture here that says forced into a great and difficult transformation, speaking about the forest. But I also think, the way that we're managing fires and looking at fires is also in a period of transformation as well. So I really like that little slide there. And I think, I know this has been touched on a little bit here, but, in North America, from, colonialization going on, we've really been kind of fearful of fire and suppressing fire and not really looking at it as a natural process in the landscape. And I think that's, certainly changing now for sure, but we have those, decades and decades of suppression that have been built up over time. And you're seeing that, the image on the right-hand side there, you can see that causes fires to burn way more intense. I saw that in Jasper for sure, even though there was a ton of work in the last 2 decades in Jasper National Park from the federal government looking at and thinning the forest out, doing fire breaks. A lot of times it's like a lot of that damage has already been done, and it takes a long time to kind of go backwards on that. So, I don't know if anyone's been to Jasper since the fire, but I would say it definitely looks like that lower left-hand side forest in a lot of spaces. And, from an ecological perspective, that takes a long time to come back. And from a recreation perspective, a lot of our trails are significantly impacted and will take, decades and decades to come back. So there's a recreation piece in there as well. And when we look at recreation more specifically, and I know I'm probably speaking to the choir here, but wildfire has a huge impact on recreation, whether it's trail closures or trail impacts, smoke from forest fires. A lot of us, living in the West Coast of Canada, experience that throughout the summer, trying to be outside and enjoy the summer. But, you have the health impacts of that as well. And it also can deter visitors from visiting a lot of communities. Infrastructure damage, campgrounds, huts, signage, and trails can be destroyed. This is a trail in Jasper that you can see is quite significantly impacted. And, not only just from the the cleanup of that takes a lot of hours to do and a lot of money. And then revenue losses, with communities, especially a lot of in British Columbia, rely on tourism and recreation as an economic life source. It can be a huge hit to that as well. And then I don't know if there's any operators on the call, but there's also safety and liability issues with the increasing risk of fire in a lot of spaces, especially if you're running trips with guests or club members as well. But I think recreationalists have a really interesting approach when it comes to resilience, is because, outdoor recreation is really rooted in a deep connection to place. We all, as recreationalists, care for trails. We have a strong connection to the ecosystems that we know, and we know them quite intimately. And I think this connection, at least I can speak for myself, really builds a strong natural sense of stewardship and responsibility. And when we think about building resilience to wildfires, there's lots of technical approaches that we can take, but we also need people who care, who can act, and who can advocate as well for change in a lot of spaces. And so that's what leads me into this whole of society approach. So resilience building is definitely a shared work. Everyone has a role, whether you're a local government, provincial government, federal government, you're a resident of a community that lives in the urban wildland interface, you're a recreation group or a club, a tourism operator. I mean, fire crews for sure, we know that their role is. Indigenous leaders, nonprofits, businesses, everyone has a role in that space. And I know this topic was really on prevention and mitigation, but everyone has a role in all of these cycles of disaster, the disaster cycle for sure. And I've seen it, my lived experience has been more about the response and recovery. And there's been lots of different stories that I can maybe speak to later, where you're seeing groups that maybe traditionally weren't really trained to be in the response step up. And so it's really interesting to see, people take different roles in these particular situations, especially when wildfire hits a community. And I'll just talk about a framework. I know Kevin already spoke a little bit about the Polis Wildfire Resilience Project, so I'll just speak a bit about that, because I think it's a really, really interesting and comprehensive framework to really talk about what does a whole of society approach look like in practice. And I think, as I was going through this, and I came across this a few months ago, so it's interesting that Kevin was involved in this, and it's quite a small world, but it really looks at, wildfires aren't just like an occasional emergency anymore. They're actually quite systemic and growing, shaped by climate change and forest conditions and our vulnerability of the communities that live in that interface. And so this document really emphasizes that, we can't really rely on traditional command and control approaches alone anymore. We actually need to take a comprehensive approach. We need to move from preventing and suppressing wildfires to coexisting with them, command and control to a shared responsibility. And then also, when you look at responsibility and authority, while the provincial government has a huge role in this, also bringing in other folks and other groups into the space, other key authority holders in communities like Indigenous leaders and, broader civil society as well. And when we think about priorities, historically, and this is changing significantly for sure, we're seeing suppression and firefighting being the main ones, and really maintaining that historical extraction economy in a lot of spaces. And then this framework really moves into, okay, so the provincial government's actually a leader and a catalyst, an enabler, and a supporter of a lot of this work. But there's a lot of other things that can go on there, whether it's ecosystem-based fuel management, prescribed and cultural burning, community-based planning, and trust building through education and local government. And I think the key takeaway here is that the provincial government still plays a critical role, but it spreads I don't say the burden, but the work that needs to get done, because we're seeing more and more communities get impacted, and there's lots of work to do, and so that's where recreation groups coming in, and different groups in community as well. And so just some general different practices, and this is definitely not a comprehensive list, but just some that I thought of. You can do shared wildfire risk mapping across different user groups and land managers, collaborative scenario planning in communities as well with, different governments, emergency services, recreation groups, businesses, and residents. So bringing together all those different voices, all those different hats. Coordinated fuel management approaches that respect that recreational use, but also has good practices in wildfire mitigation. And I'll speak to a particular example of this in a few slides. And just really knowledge sharing and socializing good practices. I think there has been a general muscle memory in society to be scared of fire or not wanting to see prescribed burns. I think that's significantly changing, but we still have a little bit of that. So really talking about a lot of this work and the importance of it, I think, is really important as well. And so here's the example that I wanted to speak to. I'm sure many folks on the webinar have heard of Logan Lake and the examples there, but they were the first community in Canada to achieve Fire Smart Community Protection Achievement in 2013. And their approach is quite interesting. They bring integrated fuel management around the town site across private land, crown land, and recreational areas. And, they bring in residents, forestry, fire crews, recreationalists, and government to really be engaged in this preparedness and mitigation phase. And you can see there, they have a Logan Lake Youth Fire Smart team, which I think was a really, really cool practice, is just engaging folks that may not traditionally be engaged in some of this work, and kind of understanding like where are your resources, who wants to be involved in creating opportunities for folks to get involved in that work. And I think the one thing that there's that really cool documentary about Logan Lake called The Test. One thing that I found was there seemed to be quite a strong social license for that proactive planning, which I think helped them deal with the Tremont Creek wildfire in 2021, and allowed them to be more prepared in the land around the town site as well, and prevent them from burning down. And I think living in Jasper, I've heard a lot of, maybe not in the last decade, but a lot of anecdotal evidence of people didn't want to see burning in the national park. There was some issues with visitation, but also just with residential sentiment around it. And so we didn't really have a strong social license, back in the day. But there are also challenges, obviously, to this whole of society approach. So, a lot of our systems are still quite siloed and limited coordination. I think as that is changing, there's a lot of obstacles to change and maneuver to free up more collaborative approaches. Limited funding. I know we already spoke about that. There is no, when we think about recreation groups, there's not a specific source of funding for a lot of this work. Generally a little bit of resistance to change in the landscape. I think a lot of us who have grown up in North America have been used to seeing fire as an enemy, or we're fearful of fire, and we're not used to the drastic change in the landscapes that we love. And so there's a little bit of that to socialize as well. And then, a lot of funding goes into more reactive approaches to disasters and climate change impacts and adaptation. So I think as much as that is shifting, I would say, the funding generally goes towards more reactive than proactive approaches to date. And there's also just gaps in inclusion of different voices in communities, and not just related to wildfire mitigation, but a lot of other things as well. So there's lots of work to do in that space. And then I think, thinking about how recreation groups can lead, have conversations, host wildfire resilience events. There was one recently in Hinton, so about an hour east of where I live. That was a recreation group that was hosting a conversation about this. And I think really using your voice and story to kind of normalize some of this work. If you have control over trailhead signage or messaging or interpretive programming with, people in your community, or whether it's visitors as well, integrate some of this messaging, preparedness messaging into that. I think was already mentioned many times by Kevin and John, but building partnerships with your local government and your local Fire Smart coordinator, and that can really help just kind of understanding what opportunities exist in your space as well. And I think to end here is recreation groups are important. We're seeing climate change is increasing our risks, not just wildfire, but many other things. And with that increased risk becomes, lots of work to do. And I think your recreations groups, they bring, local knowledge, trusted relationships, and capacity. And when we think about resilience going forward, we really need to depend on strong networks and a shared responsibility. So I think really trying to find areas that you can influence and act and take some of that responsibility on, the better off, a lot of our communities will be going forward. So that's it for me. Here's my email if anyone wants to reach out at all. And yeah, look forward to the Q&A here.
Excellent. Thanks, Brooklyn. And I'll share everybody's contact information here, folks, if you have other questions after this as well. Brooklyn, from a conversation we had the other day, you were talking about how during the fire in Jasper, that there were groups that sort of, and I think you just alluded to it a little bit, that sort of stood up and took charge and led in different ways than maybe was expected of them. Can you just touch on that? Just share that a little bit with us?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so just noting, I was actually gone for the evacuation. I was in the backcountry, living my best life, not realizing that the town had been evacuated. But when I got back into service, and then when I started working for the municipality, all these really cool stories came about different tourism operators actually stepping up and helping in the wildfire evacuation, and was not a pre-planned thing by any means. I know generally speaking, in a national park, you have your municipal government, and then you have your Parks Canada agency field unit, and then they'll be really the leaders in the evacuation and the emergency response, which is generally good practice. But what we saw was we didn't have a lot of, because we had 2 fires that blocked off 2 of the 3 evacuation roads out of Jasper. We actually couldn't get enough buses in to get people out who didn't have a vehicle. And so a rafting company, they grabbed their school bus, loaded visitors, loaded residents that didn't have a vehicle. And that, the evacuation was a span of 5 hours. So, like, that happened quite quickly. And you're just seeing people, like, they're like, well, I have that resource. I can actually go and do that. And one, actually, I meant to include it in this presentation, but there's a really cool platform that's starting to take traction called EML Canada. I'll throw the link in the chat. But it's a really cool thing if you're a local government. You can actually map out like what resources exist in your community before a fire or a flood or something like that happens that you can actually draw upon in that situation. So you don't actually have to rely on all these external resources. And so, yeah, there's a few cases of that. A lot of the rafting companies, like, we have access to this, so why not be able to use it? And so I think it was quite a beautiful story in a way.
Yeah, that's really nice. Is there, I know a lot of communities have some disaster planning going on. Is there someone in a community or at a town, a certain job title that you'd be approaching if you're an outdoor group saying, hey, I want to be a resource that you can draw on in these situations? Do you have, who would that be generally?
Yeah, generally you have like some director of protective services or that kind of department, generally speaking, who would be leading a lot of that work. I mean, in smaller communities, I might not be able to speak to that as much directly, but generally you'll have someone, if you reach out to a protective services type person, that can kind of lead you into the right space. Generally, sometimes you have like emergency management professionals that actually work. I know Jasper has one. We are kind of like a little bit of a bigger municipality than maybe some other communities that are similar that aren't in a national park. So
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. We'll go into kind of the Q&A session now. So if you have any questions, rather than raising your hand, put them in the Q&A function, and then I can ask them to our guests. And we had a few that came in during the registration. So I'll start with one of those. Let me see here. Okay, so beyond communicating fire danger rating and posting campfire bans, signage like Brooklyn mentioned, what else can outdoor clubs that manage land, trail networks and things like that communicate, or how can they communicate and manage fire danger and risk? And thinking about evacuation planning or any of those sorts of aspects, is there stuff that they should be doing or could be doing better when it comes to that communication aspect? I don't know if maybe John, do you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I mean, like, depending on the activity, there are a few, like, there are more safety tips that would encourage people to fall in the bush. But I mean, I guess what we'd want to do is like encourage things like, for one thing, like make sure you've downloaded the app, like the BC Wildfire Service app, right? Like this is one of those things we're really trying to move people away from using social media or relying on social media to get our messaging. And because the map won't only tell you like what fires are happening, they're going to tell you about prohibitions and restrictions, and they're actually quite important. Like the prohibitions are really important when they're on, to make sure people are not doing certain kinds of open fire, but also like area restrictions to make sure people are staying out of where we may have closed an area due to wildfire. So I guess communicating to their members that like you want to make sure you have these tools, and I think this kind of bleeds into another question about like what sort of information people want to have as they go into summer about like, well, making plans about where you're going to travel to and what might be happening there, whether that's going to burden that area, and and risk management around that kind of activity. But safety messaging still remains one of the big ones, right? And then kind of trying to be proactive about that, like thinking outside the box on it, like, well, if you're like motorized vehicles, being mindful of exhaust, if you're a mountain biker, being mindful of spark generation. And it's all like little things, and like these are probably extremely low risk and probability, but they do happen. So it's that kind of communication is still important.
Yeah.
I was going to quickly add in that I didn't mention
Yeah.
the issue of the risk that we create as recreation maintainers, trail users. We mow trails, and we have to pay attention to the Wildfire Act and the requirements for prohibitions on doing mowing when there's high fire risk. So if you're not familiar with it and you're doing any trail maintenance mowing, you need to be watching that fire danger rating, and you need to get onto your local fire danger. There's a series of weather stations you track, and shut down if your people are out there maintaining some trails, particularly if it's brush saws that can contact rock. That's the big one.
Just before you go there, John, we have Richard Anderson here asking about motorized access to the backcountry, noting that lots of logging roads and trails are sometimes closed when we have higher danger, and wondering if that limits any early detection and response efforts. Does that have an impact, having people in the backcountry as eyes and ears, or is it all more remote sensing these days?
As far as I know, like we don't do a ton of limiting people in the backcountry unless there are operations taking place there. I could be wrong, and again, this happens. Every fire center is different, and every fire center has their own governance structures of what they do. So I'm provincial headquarters, so I don't have like total eyes on everything that's happening around the province, but I think that's rare.
Okay.
So if we have blocked an area off, it's because there's a fire there. So we already know there's a fire, and then there are lots of eyes in that area. But yeah, that's a good question. I mean, like we do very much want, like, relying on the public is a major factor here, right? Like this is why we have our our contact numbers. You can use the app to submit photos and descriptions of the fire. So the public detection is a huge factor for us. So we do not want to limit that.
All right. Kevin or Brooklyn, maybe, do you see any gaps that exist in current wildfire prevention policies, or places that the recreation community could really fill in, or bylaws or things that could change that would make this easier for recreation groups to get involved? Maybe Kevin,
Oh
anything that
boy.
came to
We-
mind while you were doing this?
We got gaps and gaps. I think the reality is we are not doing enough. And whatever recreation groups can do to sort of support people who are trying, there's going to be a lot of debate about what kind of mitigation is effective. Like there's some really legitimate questions about whether some of these things really work. But I think if people are putting their shoulder to the wheel and trying to improve mitigation, the very least we can help say thoughtfully through where, when, how to do that. And the degree to which then recreation groups are saying things like to your local folks, we have assets, even our trails, the environment they live within, that are at risk if wildfire gets out of control. And so really lobbying for that landscape approach that sort of over time starts to move our wildfire risk down into something that's going to be more like a resilient landscape. So I think a lot of the advocacy for more, I think is a big piece.
Yeah, just be an advocate to get involved and do something.
Yeah. I would just add to that, I think, echoing everything that Kevin said, it's just really, I can't speak to a particular policy, but I feel like just looking at policy and trying to create more space for community driven and bottom up approaches. And as Kevin alluded to as well, like local communities, have a lot of resources in different spaces that may not be utilized, and people who actually do want to get involved and support, and reducing some of the red tape that might exist for those things to happen. And a lot of times, communities, I can speak to it from a Jasper lens, like in the response, at least to the wildfire, is like you have a lot of external people telling you what you need or what you want or what the future should look like for your community. And it's like there's actually a lot of people here that voice isn't heard in a lot of spaces. So, and that also feeds into preparedness as well. And so just being able to create space for that, and policy for that, I think is very helpful.
Just quickly, Brooklyn, I'm wondering, there's a couple of people asking about trail networks and whether they can be fire breaks. And I know that Logan Lake example might be a good, or maybe someone else can weigh in on it too, but I know that was sort of part of what they were doing there, was creating an opportunity to make it a little easier for fighting fires. Can you touch on that briefly just before? Yeah.
I can't speak exactly to Logan Lake. I never visited there. We just started working with them, that community. So I maybe won't speak to that, but I can speak to Jasper.
Maybe.
Yeah. I know I actually, after this, I'm going to go for a run in the new area that they just did a bunch of work in the West Valley. And they did a bunch of selective logging in there and opened it up. And so they have been doing a lot of that where they use trail networks and just create more of a fire break from that small fire break that already exists. And it's, you know what, I think there's always hesitancy on the change in the landscape, but it's actually quite beautiful because you actually have way better views of the surrounding, mountains, at least in Jasper. And so it definitely, that's an approach. And maybe I'll pass it over to fellow panelists if they want to weigh in on Logan Lake or other things in that space.
I will add that on the trails, there's a really cool movie. I can't remember where it came out of California, where a community basically worked with the Forest Service to make their trails part of the Fire Smart fire protection, fire guard network, a sort of large scale resilience plan. So I think the idea is bang on. We're not there in BC, but I do know there's actually a lot of literature that shows these kind of land use changes, whether that's grazing in the right place. Sometimes cows are actually a good thing. They reduce fuel risk. Trails can reduce fuel risk. So I think that's where we're headed. We're not there yet, but the idea is bang on.
Yeah. John?
The one thing I was going to say is like it's great to hear like people are really actually interested and excited in doing this kind of work around their trail networks. There can be situations where they might encounter pushback from some members where like they don't want to see this happen, right? They see it as altering the forest in a way that's going to like be upsetting. And it's like I can totally appreciate that, but the flip side of it is that if you don't do this work, it could burn anyways. And so the trick is recognizing the fact that, and that some of this work should be done, needs to be done. But I think Kevin mentioned like the fact that you can actually have conversations about like, well, what features do you want to keep? And like, you can negotiate. Like, it doesn't always have to look a certain way. So it's a matter of trying to figure that out. But trying to make sure that everybody's on board with this is a critical component of this for sure.
And do you have any advice for that, for those holdouts that are out there that are maybe a little bit hesitant or concerned?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think that the idea is to be patient and to recognize that their concerns are legitimate. I mean, I can fully appreciate, sometimes when you look at a treated forest, certainly the first few years, it can be a little bit shocking. But at the same time, too, you can sell them on the assets of it. Like, for example, Brooklyn, you mentioned like the views can be opened up. Suddenly there's actually line of sight to that sort of thing, which is great. But then again, it's just that wildfire resiliency picture that if you don't do it, it can burn. And Logan Lake is actually a great example of this because they lost their entire trail network. I can't remember the name of the outdoor organization, but like they operate all the cross country and snowshoe trails. They had a gun club that burned. Like, all those assets were destroyed. And as the story goes, the sad thing was they were 3 months away from starting work, and the fire happened just before they started work. So it's like, it's the time to start this was yesterday. The best time to start this is tomorrow. So
Yeah.
The sooner the better people get started on this.
Excellent. Well, we're almost out of time, so we're gonna have to wrap it up there. I think we probably could have chatted for another hour easily on this topic. So I'll just thank you all for being here. I'm gonna share my slides one more time just to end this conversation quickly. Oop, sorry. And yeah, just wanted to thank everyone for joining us, and especially Brooklyn, Kevin, and John for sharing your knowledge. This webinar is part of a regular series. The next one is scheduled for May 27th, when we'll introduce the new ORCBC resource, Outdoor Recreation for Community and Economic Development. It's a guidebook for rural communities interested in nurturing and building their outdoor recreation sector. And another exciting development I want to put on your radar is that the ORCBC is turning 50 in next year, 2026. To celebrate, we're hosting an outdoor recreation conference. There's a lot to be determined, lots to be figured out with it, but the dates and location are set. So you can plan to be in Kamloops, May 20th to 22nd in 2026. The best way to find out more about the conference, the guidebook, the webinars, and everything else the Outdoor Recreation Council is doing is to subscribe to the newsletter at orcbc.ca. Finally, please stick around to take the survey. It's a great place to let us know about anything you wish we'd cover today or any topics you'd like us to tackle in the future. It will load right after I stop talking. And with that, I will say good afternoon and goodbye. And thanks again to everybody that was in the audience and all our panelists especially. So have a great rest of your afternoon. Thank you.